At 11:32 in the morning on October 30th, 1961, Major Andrei Dunovtsev released the largest bomb humanity has ever created over the frozen waters of the Arctic Ocean. 8 meters long, 2 meters wide, 27 metric tons of pure destruction falling toward the Earth beneath a white parachute. The device had a nickname that said, "Everything about Soviet ambition, Tsar Bomba, the king of bombs." What happened next would shatter windows in Norway, level an entire settlement 55 kilometers away, send shockwaves around the globe 3 times, and create a mushroom cloud that punched through the stratosphere itself. This is the story of the most powerful explosion in human history. A blast so massive it made the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima look like a firecracker. Before we dive in, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. The chain of events that led to this moment began months earlier in Moscow. Nikita Khrushchev had given his scientists a simple order in July 1961: build a superbomb. Not just any nuclear weapon, something that would prove Soviet technological supremacy to the world. The timing wasn't coincidental. The 22nd Congress of the Communist Party was scheduled for October. Khrushchev needed a statement, a demonstration of power that would echo across every Western capital. Soviet physicists had already designed the theoretical framework, a 3-stage thermonuclear device capable of yielding 100 megatons of TNT equivalent. That's 100 million tons of explosive force, enough energy to power a small country for months. But even the Soviets understood the implications of unleashing that much destruction. They scaled it back, 50 megatons, still 3,800 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The team behind this monster included some of the most brilliant minds in nuclear physics: Andrei Sakharov, Yuli Khariton, Yakov Zeldovich, men who understood exactly what they were creating, and at least some who would later question whether they should have. The device itself defied conventional engineering. Its designers used a clean configuration with a lead tamper to minimize radioactive fallout. They weren't trying to poison the Earth. They were trying to prove a point about raw, unstoppable power. The bomber chosen for delivery was a modified Tupolev Tu-95. The bomb was so massive that engineers had to redesign the aircraft's bomb bay, remove seats, strip weight, apply special reflective paint to protect against the thermal flash that would follow detonation. Major Dunovtsev and his crew understood their survival odds were marginal at best, 50%, according to some estimates. The aircraft would have approximately 2 minutes after bomb release to escape the blast radius, 2 minutes to fly as far as possible from the center of a miniature sundae. The test site was Novaya Zemlya, a remote archipelago in the Arctic Ocean where the Soviet Union had been conducting nuclear experiments since the 1950s, specifically Cape Sukhoi Nos on Severny Island. Far from major population centers, but not far enough to contain what was coming. On the morning of October 30th, 2 aircraft departed from an airfield on the Kola Peninsula. The bomber carrying its payload, an observer plane with cameras and scientific instruments. Both crews knew they were flying into history. At 10,500 meters altitude, Major Dunovtsev received the final authorization. The bomb bay doors opened, the parachute deployed, and for the next 47 seconds, the most destructive weapon ever created fell toward the Earth below. The device was programmed to detonate at 4,000 meters above ground, high enough to maximize the blast wave, low enough to demonstrate its full fury. As those final seconds ticked away, every monitoring station across the globe held its breath. What they were about to witness would redefine humanity's understanding of its own capacity for destruction. And somewhere in those frozen waters below, an explosion was building that would make the Earth itself tremble. At exactly 4,000 meters above the frozen landscape of Novaya Zemlya, 50 megatons of nuclear fury erupted into existence. The fireball expanded faster than human comprehension, 8 kilometers in diameter within seconds. A sphere of plasma hotter than the core of the sun, vaporizing everything in its path. The flash was visible from 1,000 kilometers away, brighter than 100 suns blazing simultaneously in the Arctic sky. The thermal pulse hit first, radiation traveling at the speed of light, carrying enough energy to cause third-degree burns at distances up to 100 kilometers. The modified paint on Major Dunovtsev's bomber began to bubble and char even as the aircraft raced away from ground zero. Both the Tu-95 and the observer plane were caught in the thermal wave. Electronics flickered. Metal surfaces heated instantly. The crews felt the heat through their aircraft's hull, a furnace blast from an explosion they could barely comprehend. But the thermal pulse was just the beginning. The mushroom cloud that followed defied every previous understanding of nuclear weapons. It climbed through the atmosphere like a living thing. 10 kilometers, 20, 40, 60. Finally punching through the stratosphere itself at 70 kilometers altitude, reaching toward the mesosphere boundary. The cloud's base measured 40 kilometers across. Its top spread to 95 kilometers, a monument to destruction visible from space, casting shadows across an area larger than most European countries. The shockwave came next. Moving at hypersonic speed across the Arctic landscape, it hit the settlement of 55 kilometers from ground zero with the force of an earthquake. Every building collapsed, every structure reduced to splinters and rubble. The wave didn't stop there. It continued outward, shattering windows in buildings 160 kilometers away. Reports came in from Norway and Finland of windows exploding from overpressure. The blast had crossed international borders, turning a Soviet weapons test into a transnational catastrophe. Monitoring stations across the globe recorded the shockwave's passage. Wellington, New Zealand. Scientific outposts in Antarctica. Weather stations in Europe and Asia. The pressure wave circled the Earth 3 times before finally dissipating. Seismographs registered the explosion as a magnitude 5 earthquake, not from ground impact, but from the sheer energy release in the atmosphere above. The Earth itself trembled from humanity's most violent creation. Radio communications across the Arctic went silent. The explosion had ionized vast sections of the atmosphere, creating an electromagnetic dead zone. For nearly an hour, the northern reaches of the Soviet Union were cut off from the outside world. The aircraft crews struggled to maintain contact with ground control. Static filled their headsets. Navigation equipment flickered. They were flying blind through the aftermath of their own success, unsure if their modified aircraft would hold together long enough to reach safety. Major Dernovtsev later described the experience in stark terms. The flash had been like staring into the face of creation itself. The heat had penetrated their aircraft's shielding. The shockwave had tossed their heavy bomber like a leaf in a hurricane. But the true scale of the destruction became clear only as monitoring data flowed in from around the world. The energy release measured 2.1 times 10 to the 17th joules. That's roughly 10 times all the conventional explosives used during the entire Second World War, detonated in a single instant. Scientists compared the yield to natural disasters, volcanic eruptions, major earthquakes. The Tsar Bomba had released more energy than most natural catastrophes, concentrated into a space smaller than a city block. Heat was reportedly felt at distances exceeding 250 kilometers. Reindeer herders reported their animals panicking across vast stretches of the Arctic tundra. Seabirds abandoned their nesting grounds. The explosion had traumatized an entire ecosystem. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev received confirmation of the test's success within hours. The political message was clear. The Soviet Union possessed weapons capable of destroying entire nations, not just cities, nations. Western intelligence agencies scrambled to assess the implications. Satellite imagery showed the scale of destruction. Seismic data confirmed the yield estimates. The Cold War had entered a new phase of potential annihilation. But even as Soviet propaganda celebrated their technological triumph, some of the scientists involved began to question what they had unleashed. Andrei Sakharov, one of the bomb's key designers, would later advocate for limiting nuclear testing. The monster they had created was too powerful for any rational military purpose. The world had witnessed the closest thing to artificial apocalypse that humanity could create, and everyone understood that this was not the limit of destruction. This was merely a demonstration. The Soviets had deliberately scaled back from 100 megatons. They had shown restraint, but the message was unmistakable. If we can do this, imagine what we choose not to do. In Washington, D.C., CIA analysts pored over seismic readings and satellite imagery with growing alarm. The Soviets hadn't just tested a nuclear weapon, they had demonstrated a capability that rendered existing military doctrine obsolete. The numbers were staggering. 50 megatons represented more than 40 times the yield of America's largest operational warhead. It was 3 times more powerful than Castle Bravo, the United States' most destructive test. In a single detonation, the Soviets had proved they could level entire metropolitan areas. But the true genius of the Tsar Bomba wasn't just its raw power. It was the engineering that made such power possible. The device used a 3-stage thermonuclear design, fission-fusion-fusion. The first stage triggered a primary fusion reaction. That fusion reaction triggered a secondary fusion stage, and that secondary stage triggered a third fusion reaction of unprecedented scale. Each stage amplified the previous one exponentially. The primary fission trigger measured in kilotons, the secondary fusion stage measured in megatons. The final fusion stage pushed the yield beyond anything previously achieved. The lead tamper surrounding the fusion fuel served a dual purpose. It reflected neutrons back into the reaction, increasing efficiency. But it also prevented the uranium tamper that would have doubled the yield to 100 megatons. The Soviets had chosen a clean bomb that limited fission byproducts and radioactive fallout. Western scientists analyzing the test data realized they were looking at a breakthrough in weapons physics. The Soviets had solved fundamental problems in scaling thermonuclear reactions. They had demonstrated that there was essentially no upper limit to nuclear weapon yields. The political implications were immediate and terrifying. If the Soviets could build a 50-megaton weapon, they could build a 100-megaton weapon, or larger. The only constraints were engineering challenges and delivery systems. President John F. Kennedy convened emergency sessions with his national security team. The United States had fallen behind in the most critical arms race in human history. Soviet nuclear superiority now threatened the entire foundation of American deterrent strategy. Publicly, American officials downplayed the test's significance. They called it a wasteful demonstration without practical military value, too large for tactical use, too unwieldy for strategic deployment, a propaganda stunt that revealed Soviet desperation rather than strength. Privately, Pentagon analysts understood the truth. The Tsar Bomba wasn't designed for military deployment. It was designed to prove a point. The Soviet Union could destroy any target on Earth with a single weapon. Cities, military installations, entire regions. Khrushchev's propaganda machine worked overtime to amplify the message. Soviet newspapers described the test as a demonstration of capability for 100 megatons and more. The implication was clear. What you witnessed was restrained. What we could do has no limits. The test film itself became a weapon of psychological warfare. Soviet cameramen had captured the explosion from multiple angles: ground cameras, aircraft cameras. The footage showed the Earth itself recoiling from human-made destruction, but the international response was swift and damning. The test violated no existing treaties, but it shattered the informal moratorium on atmospheric testing that had been holding since 1958. The Soviets had reignited the nuclear arms race with the largest explosion in human history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from today, and if this story hits you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Allied governments condemned the test publicly. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan called it an act of nuclear vandalism. French President Charles de Gaulle described it as an assault on human civilization. Even non-aligned nations expressed horror at the scale of destruction. The test site itself told its own story of unprecedented devastation. Aerial surveys revealed the complete obliteration of the Seveny settlement, not damaged, not destroyed, obliterated, as if it had never existed. The permafrost had been superheated and vaporized across hundreds of square kilometers. Rock formations had been pulverized. The landscape itself had been fundamentally altered by the explosion's energy release. Animals across the Arctic region showed signs of trauma. Reindeer migrations were disrupted. Seabird colonies abandoned traditional nesting areas. The ecosystem had been shocked by an event beyond any natural disaster in recorded history. Soviet scientists monitoring the test site discovered something unexpected in their post-explosion analysis. The device had performed beyond even their theoretical projections. The energy coupling was more efficient than predicted. The fusion reactions had sustained longer than calculated. They had built a weapon more powerful than they intended. The margin of error in nuclear weapons design, they realized, could mean the difference between destroying a city and destroying a region. The technical data from the test would inform weapons development for decades, but it also revealed a disturbing truth about the nature of thermonuclear weapons. Each advancement in yield came with exponentially increasing risks of uncontrolled destruction. As radiation monitoring stations around the globe tracked fallout patterns from the test, a chilling realization emerged. The Tsar Bomba's clean design had limited immediate contamination, but the precedent it set was catastrophic. The world had just witnessed a demonstration that nuclear weapons had no practical upper limit. If the Soviets could build this, what would stop them from building something even larger, and more terrifying still? What would stop anyone else from trying to match it? The shockwaves from Novaya Zemlya didn't stop at national borders. They reverberated through the halls of power in every nuclear nation on Earth. Within weeks of the test, American atmospheric testing resumed under Operation Nougat. The nuclear moratorium that had held for 3 years shattered like windows in Finland, but the Tsar Bomba had accomplished something no Soviet leader expected. It had horrified the very scientists who created it. Andrei Sakharov, the brilliant physicist who had helped design the monster, watched the test footage with growing unease. The explosion he had engineered was beautiful in its terrible symmetry, and completely without military purpose. The weapon was too large for any conceivable target, too heavy for practical delivery systems, too powerful for tactical use without destroying friendly forces. The Tsar Bomba existed solely to prove that such destruction was possible. Sakharov began to question the morality of unlimited nuclear weapons development. He would later become one of the Soviet Union's most prominent advocates for arms control. The man who helped create the ultimate weapon became its most effective critic. But the damage was already done. The test had triggered a new phase of the arms race that neither superpower could control. Global monitoring networks tracked atmospheric contamination from the Soviet test series throughout 1961 and 62. The cumulative fallout from dozens of atmospheric explosions created radiation levels that peaked worldwide in the early 1960s. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation documented increasing global radiation doses, strontium-90 in milk supplies, cesium-137 in agricultural products. The atmosphere itself had become a repository for radioactive contamination. Public concern about nuclear fallout intensified dramatically. Peace movements in Western nations organized massive demonstrations. Scientists published open letters calling for test bans. The specter of global contamination from weapons testing galvanized international opposition. By 1963, even the superpowers recognized that atmospheric testing threatened their own populations. The Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed on August 5, 1963. It prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. The treaty didn't end nuclear weapons development. It drove testing underground. But it represented the first successful limitation on nuclear weapons since their invention. The Tsar Bomba had been so destructive that it forced its own prohibition. Khrushchev's political gamble had backfired. Instead of demonstrating Soviet strength, the test had revealed the fundamental insanity of unlimited nuclear escalation. The weapon that was supposed to intimidate the West had instead motivated successful arms control efforts. The test site on Novaya Zemlya became a monument to humanity's capacity for environmental destruction. Between 1955 and 1990, the Soviet Union conducted 224 nuclear tests on the archipelago. The cumulative contamination rendered vast areas uninhabitable. The ecology of the Arctic region never fully recovered. Persistent radioactive isotopes remain embedded in the permafrost. Marine ecosystems show evidence of long-term genetic damage. The clean bomb had still left permanent scars on one of Earth's last pristine wilderness areas. Local populations of indigenous peoples were relocated multiple times as testing expanded. Traditional hunting and fishing grounds became radiation exclusion zones. Entire cultures were displaced by the pursuit of ultimate weapons. The declassified film released by Rosatom in 2020 revived international debate about nuclear weapons. 40 minutes of footage showing the Tsar Bomba explosion in unprecedented detail. The images were simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. Modern audiences watching the declassified footage confronted the same questions that had haunted Sakharov and his colleagues. What does it mean for a species to possess such destructive power? What responsibilities come with the ability to obliterate entire regions? The technical legacy of the Tsar Bomba influenced weapons design for decades. Its three-stage fusion design became the template for modern thermonuclear weapons. Every nuclear power studied its principles. Every nuclear power built smaller, more practical versions. Today, 9 nations possess nuclear weapons. Several maintain arsenals with combined yields exceeding the Tsar Bomba thousands of times over. The monster created at Novaya Zemlya spawned an entire generation of more efficient, more deployable weapons of mass destruction. The mathematical progression is simple and terrifying. The Tsar Bomba proved that nuclear yields have no practical upper limit. Fusion fuel is abundant. The engineering challenges are solvable. The only constraints are political will and international agreements. Arms control treaties have prevented another Tsar Bomba, but they haven't eliminated the knowledge that created it. The scientific principles remain in textbooks. The engineering solutions remain in classified archives. The capability remains dormant, waiting for the next crisis to awaken it. 64 years after the test, the world possesses approximately 13,000 nuclear warheads. Most are more sophisticated than the Tsar Bomba, smaller, more accurate, more survivable, more usable. The ultimate irony of Khrushchev's super bomb is that it was too large to be practical. Its successors learned the lesson. Maximum destruction doesn't require maximum yield. It requires maximum credibility. The Tsar Bomba remains the largest explosion in human history, but it's no longer the most dangerous weapon we possess. That distinction belongs to the thousands of smaller, smarter, more deployable weapons that its test made possible. The mushroom cloud that punched through the stratosphere on October 30th, 1961, carried with it more than radioactive debris. It carried the proof that human civilization now possessed the technical capability to destroy itself, not by accident, not through natural disaster, through deliberate choice. The men who built the Tsar Bomba understood exactly what they were creating. They built it anyway, they tested it anyway, they proved it worked anyway, and in doing so, they answered the most fundamental question of the nuclear age. Can humans be trusted with the power of gods? The Arctic wind still carries their answer across the frozen wasteland of Novaya Zemlya, where the king of bombs once ruled for 47 seconds and changed the world forever. If this story has shown you anything about humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction, hit that subscribe button, because the next time we gather our nuclear inheritance, we might not be so fortunate to have scientists who remember why restraint matters. And in the end, that might be the most terrifying lesson of all.